I am Mr. Beat, and I'm live here. The date is February 3rd, 2025, and there's a really important topic I would like to talk to you about tonight, and that is social studies education. Obviously, as a social studies teacher, I've been teaching social studies since 2009. This is something really important to me, and maybe it's a little too dorky for most of you, but I'm hoping to reel some of you in because yeah, it's gosh darn important. And you may be realizing we're living through a tumultuous time. It seems a bit more chaotic than previous years. And I always go back to like, all right, let's compare it to the past. And I feel like we're living in a time where uh, learning history and all of the social studies in general, it's just not prioritized as it once was. And I know that people have said this in the past, and it goes in cycles. But I compare it often to my own experience learning social studies and also teaching it later on. I will tell you that when I began teaching social studies in 2009, I was teaching middle schoolers, and I noticed that, and a big reason why, by the way, I should say, is No Child Left Behind. But the fact that there's just a lot more emphasis on math and science in particular, or just really STEM versus social studies. And I bring up the example when I bring this up to anybody. I bring up the example of when I taught middle school social studies. I literally had to give up a week of instruction time for testing, and it wasn't testing. It was standardized testing for the state when I taught in Nebraska, also when I taught in Kansas. And this mandatory state testing, which the scores are really important. It was really important that the kids did well on these tests. It was directly tied to funding, national, federal funding. But I lost 1 week's worth of instruction time trying to teach social studies, 1 week, so that they could get tested in science, math, and reading, in English, I should say. So not they weren't even tested in social studies, and so I will never forget that. And it was kind of a pivotal moment. And then it's not just me; I'm not just going crazy. That is the general trend, and we're seeing it in real time. We're seeing social studies scores, and I put all the links in the description for this information if you want to explore this more deeply. But there has been evidence, studies, and also test scores that has shown that social studies achievement has declined. And so we're going to look at that here in a moment. But first, I want to introduce my special guest who is going to talk to me about this. And they also have a wonderful resource that could help alleviate this trend. So let me introduce to you the fantastic Mark Shubert. Thanks for joining us, Mark.
Hello. Nice to be here.
Mark reached out to me via electronic mail, and I'm so glad that I think Mrs. B caught the initial email, but I'm so glad we caught it, and we met up, and you shared with me a wonderful resource you've been working on quite diligently for a while, and we're going to show that off here in a moment. But before we get into that, maybe just share a little bit about yourself and why you're so into social studies and passionate about this stuff.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for the time. Hello, everyone. My name is Mark Shubert. I am the founder and chair of Tarpeia. Our legal name is Amending America, so there's a little bit of confusion about that, but we go by Tarpeia now. And this is an educational nonprofit. It is a 501c3, and we have been in operation for 2 years now, although I have started this project 5 years ago, back in December of 2019. This is my freshman year in college, and I am studying finance at that time, and I got my degree in finance, but I had a passion for American history and specifically American politics. And one of the reasons why I studied finance instead of going down history is because I understand that most political issues, especially nowadays, but also in the past, can be fixed with sound financial policy. And so I was kind of approaching history through the financial lens. And part of my education, I just decided to start a website where I gathered as many primary source documents as I was reading to study American history. I started with the Constitution, and then the Declaration of Independence, and then all of these different primary source documents like State of the Union addresses, inaugural addresses, and I just put it all together on one site. And it just grew and grew to the point where I have thousands of primary source documents now, over 3,000 right now. And I just reorganized it and decided to incorporate as a nonprofit and turn it into something that isn't just for me, but for everyone who wants to study American history. It's available for students. Everything that we do is free, by the way. So it's available for students. It's available for teachers at any grade level. It's available for researchers, academics, scholars, anyone who's doing research on American history and who would like to just learn more than the bare minimum basics that a lot of the standards in education around the country are requiring. And so one of our characteristics of our project and why it's so comprehensive is we're going through every single state standards for history education and civics, and we actually have a page on our site that's like a portal to all 50 state educational standards, and I'm looking at every single one of them, and I'm adding all the primary source documents that they all require. So one of the reasons why it's such a large project is because there is a lot to gather, not just historically, but in terms of education, because there's just so much that people require. And even though there's a lot that people require, it's, to me, not enough for actually understanding American history. So we're not just looking at the current standards. We want to enrich and expand and augment the current standards to improve them. And so that's a little bit about us to get this conversation started.
Sure. Yeah. And we will go into your site more here later, but kind of bringing it back to, and that's what the site looks like. The link is in the description. I put links to all these pages I'm going to be sharing with you in the description. But zooming back out, social studies. First of all, how would you define social studies, Mark?
Well, the studies of our society, of course, that includes history of politics, that includes how people interact with each other. So, more broadly, it includes our culture, it includes religious trends, it includes fashion trends. Again, that's more broadly, but I mostly focus on political history. So, social studies regarding politics includes things like our Constitution, state constitutions, laws, Supreme Court decisions, executive orders, things that occur on the political level by political officers of our society. And so just studying the history of that gives us a clear understanding of the social and political environment that we live in today. And I know there's a lot of people who complain about the current situation, but you can't fix anything if you don't understand what you're trying to fix. So if you want to fix the current politics, current education, then you have to understand it and you have to do all that research, which is not easy to do. It takes years of studying, but hopefully this resource will cut down the amount of time it takes to study American history.
We have removed the racist in the comments, so don't worry. Sorry about that. Yeah, I would have to, if I want to simplify what social studies are, I would just say learning about us as human beings. And yeah, again, I'm biased, but I think that it's the most important subject because you can't learn anything else if you can't learn how to get along with your fellow human beings. And the most important thing for human beings, whether they realize it or not, in my opinion, but I'm pretty sure this is right, is the survival of our species. And we take it for granted that, oh, human beings are just going to be around forever. No, we're not. We've only been around for 300,000 years approximately. And we've made it work this long because we've been able to cooperate. We've been able to learn that we are better off with each other. That's the only reason why our species has survived so long, is because we've figured out ways to get along. And actually, if you look evolutionarily, like speaking, that's I mean, everything that we do today makes more sense when you look at the evolutionary history of it in particular. But that aside, I mean, I know when we think of social studies today, we're thinking about stuff that's typically taught in public schools, not just in the United States, but around the world. So things like, oh, world history or geography or economics, hopefully economics, although that's not taught enough, government, um, ancient civilizations, stuff like that. Um, I know you and I are most passionate about American political history, but that's just a sliver. And so I think the bigger thing we need to remember is that it doesn't mean learning social studies doesn't mean we have to learn all the specific details of every major event in history or memorize all these facts or these names of people, memorize dead people. It's more about the lessons that we learn, and we tell these stories in history to teach the lessons, which ultimately is so that we survive as a species. And if there was just, I always tell people, if there was only one human being on the planet, then social studies would not be necessary. But because there's more than one of us, there's more than 8 billion of us now. I think that, that's probably why it's more important than ever. And no offense to mathematics or English or science or any other subject, but if you can't learn how to survive in a group of people, then why does anything else matter? But let's talk about, okay, so I put that on the screen already. I'm going to put this back up. We have actual evidence here that social studies scores have gone down in recent years. This is, if you go to this website here, the Nation's Report Card, you can see specifically, they show all the subjects here. They show civics going down, geography going down, U.S. history going down. And then if you look at other evidence, social studies instructional support remains scarce at state and local levels. So there's less resources being left for social studies. I want to share this article here because it says, I'm just going to read the first paragraph. It really caught my attention. Again, all these links are in the description. It says, for the first time since 1994, the results for history saw a dip. The last time the United States history test was given was 2018, and the average score was 263. However, the 2022 administration saw an average scores of 258. So, should we be freaking out about this? No, but this is definitely not the direction we want to go. I think this is a good opportunity now, Mark, to bring up what you were telling me before we went live. That old book that you read, was it from 1944?
Yeah, so it was from 1944. It's called American History in Schools and Colleges, and it's more of a report, like a commission report, than an actual book, but it was published at the start of 1944, so during World War II, and it was written by a bunch of history teachers, scholars, academics who were also concerned about the decline in Americans' understanding of American history, although they say some pretty interesting things about American history as it's understood by the population at that time. Like, for example, they say that recounting specific names and dates of events is pretty low, but being able to understand lessons, overall lessons of history, is relatively high, or at least acceptable according to their standards. Of course, standards are now different nowadays. So it's interesting to see how they were also concerned about the decrease in education in the United States. This is going on 80 years now, and yet we still have problems. So some things don't change, some things change a little bit, but hopefully we can figure out a way to actually fix education, history education in the United States.
And for those of you saying that maybe it's just COVID because scores have gone down in other areas, this trend actually started before then. And again, I want to bring up the fact that No Child Left Behind was, if you look at actually, let me pull this tab up. The scores began to decline in 2014. And I noticed this when I was still, I left the classroom in 2021, and I noticed that there was just, I mean, it's just the fact that there's less requirements. You don't need as many social studies credits to graduate in a lot of high schools, for example. Here's another study. New study reveals 80% of secondary social studies teachers and administrators believe more social studies education is needed, yet only 8% say it is a top priority at their school. So this shows a disconnect. I think it's not, I mean, it's pretty revealing when the actual social studies teachers are all saying the same thing about this, like these two thoughts that are like, oh yeah, these kids don't know social studies, and at the same time, yeah, my boss, my bosses, they don't think it's important. So both of those things being true, definitely alarming. This is another longer article that I shared in the link. I encourage all of you to read these. This article here, let's see if you can see, it's kind of small. That's okay. So this goes into basically different talking points to think about. So talking point A here says the time devoted to teaching core social studies subjects in elementary grades, such as civics, history, geography, and economics, is being severely reduced. This article in particular focused on North Carolina, but this is a trend we've seen in other places around the country. The second talking point, testing is driving what is taught. Other tested subjects, most notably language arts and math, have been increased within the school day, thus cutting the time for social studies dramatically. So we know what's prioritized right now. And then I mentioned that horrible law, No Child Left Behind, which I will make a video on eventually. A lot of people want me to make a video about this, but the idea that you had a law that made it so that funding was tied to test scores. And so you had this test-based accountability program that led to not only like school districts manipulating the data of the scores that were sent, but also just the only things that were prioritized were the subjects that were being tested. Everything else was pushed to the back burner. Everything else. It's not just social studies, by the way. It's also art, music, which, you know, culturally, I think we've seen a shift overall. Like, oh no, it's totally more cool to go into STEM. That's where the money is. That's where the cool kids go. Like I always bring up the Big Bang Theory when we look at the like that was a show that kind of epitomized that that culture shift. Like, oh no, we need to be going to space, or we need to be computer programmers, you know. So anyway, I've got all that out of the way. Let's talk about your resource. Or unless there's anything else you want to say more broadly speaking before we get into it, Mark.
Well, I mean, you know, maybe we can go a little bit and cover why we should learn social studies and American history in particular. The book that I read in preparation for this stream basically says that the point of education, and more specific to history education, is to develop three main skills or characteristics, and that is citizenship, productivity, and enlightenment, to have more well-rounded, and that's part of the citizenship and having good neighbors. And so that's kind of like the new motto of our nonprofit as well. And I just want your thoughts. I know you made a video, one of your first videos was why learn American history. So if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think the most important part of social studies education is the citizenship part, the part that, I mean, I think that's why it's important that, yeah, I mean, I understand why some parents want to homeschool their kids, and some of them do that very well, and your resource is good for that in particular. But I think part of learning social studies is just interacting with kids that are a lot different than you. Like I know that Mrs. Beat and I, we chose where our daughters go to school primarily based on the fact that they would be encountering a wide range of different types of people. I'm not just talking about ethnic background or religion. I'm talking about socioeconomic. I'm talking about people that have just radically different experiences growing up, because if you learn how to interact with people that are really different than you as early as preschool, kindergarten, that carries over to adulthood. So that starts with, being a good citizen in kindergarten class is paves the way for being a good citizen in society overall. It helps build empathy. Empathy to me is the pillar. I think that most people can, like, you can kind of convince somebody that it's important because, like, oh yeah, empathy, yeah, you're right. Like, we want to care for strangers, not just people we know, not just friends and family, but strangers.
Mm.
That is pretty important. Yeah. So that kind of carries over to that.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that having people grow up with a diverse uh, um, population instead of just having one specific group that they, especially if it's homeschool and they just are educated by their family and they don't really go out much. Although there are some homeschool organizations which are ironically not really homeschool, they're like pseudo schools where it's a bunch of homeschool students who get together. So that is a solution for getting people more engaged in the public when it comes to homeschools. But yeah, just empathy through experience. I think it's very difficult to try to teach empathy from a textbook or from a lecture. It's really effective to teach empathy through real life experience. I'm an Eagle Scout in the Boy Scouts, or now it's called just Scouts, and I've done tons of volunteering. I live in Georgia, so I volunteered at Habitat for Humanity. I never met Judy Carter, but I would volunteer for them, building houses. And for my history, I've just done a ton of volunteering. And doing that definitely helps with building citizenship and empathy for those, especially those who are not as well privileged as I am economically. And maybe that experience volunteerism throughout my teenage years into my college years helped encourage me in the back of my mind to start a charity of my own.
Absolutely. And I think a byproduct of learning social studies is the fact that you often have to read and to learn these stories. Like, there's not
Yep.
a video about everything. I'm getting there, though. One day there will be a video about everything. But yeah, so media literacy, but also just literacy, period. I mean, I think, okay, yeah, I said social studies was the most important thing to learn. But after that, probably reading, because if you can read well, you can teach yourself to do anything well. But yeah, like, I think this is a good segue to what you have put together, because um, I just think it's one of the best resources I've seen, and what you're doing is truly, like, it's a public service. So if you could maybe explain your website.
Yeah, so this is the homepage of our site. If you scroll down a little bit, it looks a little bit better. And what we got three main programs. Only one of the programs is really up and running at the moment, and it's called the Compendium. And the Compendium is our online repository of primary source documents. And so what you see now is how we divide American history up into eras, and then each era is divided into chapters. And each of these chapters, so if you click on, say, that chapter, it will take you to a page that has a timeline. And this is a visual timeline
Sorry.
of primary source documents. And right now, so scroll down a little bit.
Nice.
So that is the timeline.
Sorry, it's
And
being a
we
little slow.
have,
My bad.
you're good. So that's the timeline. Each of those events on the timeline are either events or primary source documents. So you can click on one of them. It's under the image. Yep. And then what I like about this timeline format is you can embed videos. And so you can actually watch that video. That's Bush Sr.'s inaugural address. And then we have all the State of the Union addresses. We have a bunch of Supreme Court decisions. All of the Supreme Court decisions that you see on the compendium is, well, most of them are your videos on the
Let's go
Supreme
there.
Court briefs.
Yeah. Here, the Supreme Court timeline. Is that what you're referencing? I hope I'm not too early.
Yeah, so we have your videos also on the compendium, but we also dedicate an entire timeline just on the Supreme Court. And so we have about 200 Supreme Court decisions, and I know you have like 83 videos that you've done on the Supreme Court briefs. And so if you click again on the Chisholm, so that's your video that you made on that
Mr.
Supreme
Beat
Court decision.
presents Supreme
And then-
Court.
Nice.
Yep, you can watch it. And then you can just look on the timeline. You see those colored sections at the bottom. Those are the Chief Justices. So those are all of the courts of the United States. The J Court, Marshall Court, Taney Court, so on and so forth. And so if you want an overview of Supreme Court history with quick access to all these Supreme Court decisions, and of course your videos on them, this is a good resource for that.
You need to make a video about that one. Nice.
Mhm.
Okay. All right. Where else should I go here? Should I go back to the? Let me
Yeah, you can go back to the homepage, or that. Yeah, that's good.
Okay.
And so this is our main program that we got, and it's up and running. Although we have 3,000 documents, this is only like 1% of what we plan on having on the site. So there's a ton more work that still needs to be done when it comes to the amount of primary source documents that we include. And so if there are anyone in the audience who would like to volunteer, we are accepting volunteers. You can go on our site. We have a career page that you can go and check out and apply, and then we can do an interview and see if you're qualified for joining our team. But we are looking for interviews or volunteers and to do more of this work. So that's our first program. Our second program is the curriculum, and I don't have to show you on here. You could just have fun looking at the compendium. But the curriculum is going to be our core curriculum is going to have 9 courses. Each course is going to cover a different era of American history. Yep. And each of these, it's the same chapters, it's the same eras as the compendium. So there's continuity between those two programs. And what we're doing is on the curriculum, we are writing summaries for all of the primary source documents. We're curating quizzes and lesson plans, DBQs, homework assignments. So it's going to be a resource not only for students to learn beyond what they are taught in school, but also for teachers. So if a teacher wants to look at what we got going on, maybe they like one of our essay prompts, maybe they like one of our discussion questions, maybe they like one of our quizzes, they can take any of our stuff that we got going on. Again, everything that we do is free. And then they can apply that and implement it into their lesson plans. So that's the curriculum, and that's still being curated. So again, we're looking for volunteers to help us do all that. And then the third program is called the Praeconium, which is just Latin for being a publisher and like a newspaper. And we are going to be eventually, we're not a publisher yet, but I do want to become a publisher of academic papers. So like a journal, like an academic journal for American history. And I was inspired by this from being a member of the Organization of American Historians. So it's not a program that is up and running at the moment, but just so you know what we got going on, we're still very much in the startup phase of our nonprofit. There's still a lot of things that we got to do and set up. So the more support that we get now, the more that support will benefit us because we are still in the early stages. So, you know, $1 today is like $100 eventually. And so donate, encourage your audience to donate as much as possible. And so, yeah, that's just a little bit about what we got going on and about the compendium. And eventually this will become a much bigger and more impressive project than what you see right now.
It's already very impressive. This is a treasure. I love it. I'm so glad you reached out because this is such a, like, if you're a teacher watching right now, this is an excellent resource. This is like a one-stop shop for you to send your students, especially now that most classrooms are one-to-one. They all have a device that they can quickly log on to. You can just put a link on Google Classroom, and there you go. If you're a teacher, we want to hear from you, especially. Oh, we got some super chats. So thanks to Adam for joining. Let's see here. CJB. Thank you. The 2024 election video script is done. It's coming out on Valentine's Day. I don't know what Dill is trying to say here, but hello. Thanks for the super chat. If you have other questions, though, we will be here now. The name of the site is
Tarpeia. Tarpeia.us.
Link is in the
we also have the domain amendingamerica.us. So that just redirects to the site.
How long you been doing this now?
So I started the website December of 2019, and then I incorporated it as a nonprofit in May of 2022. So just under 3 years as a nonprofit, but over 5 years as a project.
It's wonderful. And I love the, like, kind of your slogan there. Both of those slogans, bridging the chasm between the frontier of scholarship and what's in the classroom. If you are somebody who is a parent who homeschools, we would also like to hear from you. Or most of you are just here because you're curious people. You like to learn, especially American history. So I think this is for you as well. Don't be intimidated to dive right in here. You, like, one of my favorite things to do is just to look through archives, and there's always gems. A lot of times it's photographs, those kind of catch. But like other times, it's articles, and you're reading stuff that you're like, holy crap, this all happened in one day. All like, we think we live in crazy times now, but actually most of history was pretty crazy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
And
go ahead.
Oh, so I mean, yeah, just on that, when I was studying all of the State of the Union addresses, and you just learned so much about American history just by reading those. There's so much that we have forgotten and that isn't taught in schools. Like, for example, Truman's first State of the Union address, he talks about how he and the United States in general prevented the Soviet invasion of Iran. And like, I never knew that. Back in 1946, 45, 46, Soviet Union tried to invade Iran, and then we stopped them. Like, I never heard that in any history book or any documentary about Truman or anything like that. And yet it's just right there in the primary source document. And then, you know, he talks about the Marshall Plan. Like, who was General Marshall? Well, I have General Marshall's speech that he gave a year before his plan was enacted. There's just so much about American history that is left under the table, that history textbooks, that history teachers aren't even taught in preparing them to teach students. There's just so much scholarly work out there that being I guess presented to or communicated to students. And I think that is one of the reasons why we have a declining rate in terms of the quality of education, again, specifically to history and in test scores. Just looking at how the government spends the money, a lot of that money, grants especially, go to academics who do like high-end research that isn't published for the public. It's behind paywalls. You have to be part of a library and all these other things. And it's written in a way that's only meant for other scholars and other academics. So a lot of that scholarly work is not trickling down to the student, when it should be the student who receives this scholarly work first to trickle it up to increase, you know, the goals of history education, that is citizenship. You know, how can we expect to have good citizens or even just basically educated citizens when we're not doing everything that we can to educate them, and instead keeping all that education up beyond where students can even reach. Again, behind paywalls and all these organizations like the Organization of American Historians, they do a lot of scholarly work. Very little, if any of that, ever goes to the classroom. So that's one of my gripes that I have with current
Yeah.
academia.
Well, because also like a lot of the students can actually do that work, the research, and they can go treasure hunting. I always try to have my students be like, you're the historian, you find something that no one has ever seen before, and then come back and share that story, because it's really cool to like have this secret story that no one knows about. That's one of the things I try to do lately is like you have to dig deep sometimes, but there are hidden gems out there that it's pretty cool. It's to get to share that with other people. Um, Caleb says, I'm a student. What's the applicability for history? So yeah, like I think what you're trying to say here is like, how does this
Voting.
translate? Yeah, how does this translate to the real world? Like skills to excel in a career in the 21st century. What do you think?
Well, I think it's mostly impacting how we vote. And, if we don't understand history for whatever reason, if, people generally on the right who like to praise history as much as any historian does, but they don't really go deep enough in actually understanding, truly appreciating, which we have a surface level definition of appreciation, which is like gratitude and respect. But there's another definition of appreciate, which means to understand something. And so they're not really appreciating the history behind a lot of this. And then you have people on the left who are kind of like doing the opposite, where they don't like the history of something because it reminds them of something that another thing that they don't like, and so they don't want to get their hands. Neither side wants to get their hands dirty, because one side praises history, but they don't want to see all of the bugs when you lift up the rock, and then one side doesn't like history, so they don't want to do anything with it at all. And that is impacting how we vote. That impacts how we view each other, which right now is a big thing in politics. I don't want to get too much into modern day politics, but yeah, so it really impacts our citizenship, how we treat each other, how we view each other, how our own identity as a people, as a nation, and that impacts politics. Politics impacts everything in our lives. It impacts the economy. It impacts the kind of jobs that we have, the job opportunities that we have. It impacts education on all the other fields. So, history education might not be the most impressive when it comes to career jobs than, say, STEM, where you're building space rockets or you're doing brain surgery. That it might not be as impressive, but we won't have space rockets if our nation is falling apart, if we don't have a good economy. We won't have good surgeons if we don't have the funding to hospitals and to medical research. So it's like it's not as fancy as some, but it's more important. It's the root of the success of all those other fields, in my opinion.
I would say, yeah, well put, very well put. Bravo. I would add a few things. First of all, I would say that most skills are technical, which means like they're not, you can't really translate them to very many other fields. Like, whereas if you have a degree in any kind of social sciences, like say you're considering getting a degree in history, for example, like I have a master's in history, and I think that's helped me more than just like, oh, more about history. I think it also teaches you more about how to research properly, how to analyze sources, corroborate, and evaluate a wide range of sources, but also learning how to synthesize and create something entirely new from everything you've researched, and to just critically think in general. Not only that, like learning more and more about different types of people, it helps you work in a diverse team, no matter what your team is, no matter what the field is. So yeah, like these are practical skills that do translate to no matter what career you end up having, which many of you probably will have careers that don't exist yet. I know you've heard that before from a counselor, and it's really cringy and cliche when they say it, but it's true. Uh, Carl says, and we already kind of answered this, but I'm glad they asked it again. What do you perceive as a solution to social studies decline? Well, first of all, your website is a good solution. What else?
Yeah, I mean, I do see a lot more work done by internet communicators like you and I, while institutions, especially coming this term, this presidential term, where there's going to be a decrease in funding, that will probably not help when it comes to fixing the decline in social studies. So it is more weight when it comes to educating students is going to be on your shoulders, Mr. Beat. It's going to be on other communicators to kind of fill in the gaps that students have in current academia and current school system. I watched your videos when I went through high school and college. The Supreme Court briefs were very helpful when I took a course on constitutional law and civil rights. So your videos have helped me probably more than your traditional textbook has helped me when it comes to studying American history, because you cover so much material, and you do it in a way that's actually enjoyable and engaging. It's more engaging to watch one of your videos than it is to read a textbook written 10, 20, 30 years ago, in a way that most students don't really enjoy reading in that way anymore. They prefer more engaging content. And so I think a solution to social studies, to improving social studies, is more work like what you do, Mr. Beat, when it comes to communicating social studies to students. Because I don't see in the next 4 years, this administration in particular, but even the previous administrations, doing much to actually solve the issue of decreasing social studies scores. So, I mean, we're going to be impacted as well as budget cuts when it comes to grants to organizations and charities like mine. So we're going to be needing as much support as possible in the next 4 years. Hopefully that is overturned and changed. But yeah, so I don't really think that the institutions that we currently have is doing much to finding a solution and actually implementing a solution. It's not just finding a solution. I think we all know what the solution is. It's actually implementing the solution, which is simply making better history content.
I appreciate the kind words, by the way. That was nice of you to say, and that's cool that it helps you. I think that, yeah, I mean, if you feel like you could participate as well, start your own YouTube channel or TikTok channel. Well, TikTok may not be around forever, but whatever the platform, I do think there's still value in getting a history degree. And I just double checked on this. I'll pull up the, I think this, like there has been a decline also in the number of students seeking a history degree. So I think the culture does need to change. Perhaps I always think it's funny when someone says they don't like history. And I think the reason why they think that is because they had a bad experience in school. Like it's the same thing. The same reason why I said I hate math is because I didn't have good experiences. Like I had math teachers that were kind of mediocre. They were more there to coach basketball or football than to teach me math. But same thing with history. If you ever told a story about something that happened to you over the weekend to your coworkers or your friends, you like history because you're sharing your own history with your friends. So it's absurd to think that someone doesn't like history. We all like history, whether we realize it or not. And so I think it's just a matter then of marketing, changing the culture, convincing everyone that no, history is actually really cool because like, anytime you share a story with anyone, you're pretty much sharing history. I think we frame it that way. Is that a good way to frame it, or is that kind of?
Yeah, I mean, doing more, communicating more, I think is definitely part of the solution. Now, what we communicate and how we communicate is obviously another question. Although we have our website, we also have a YouTube channel. We actually have multiple YouTube channels. One of them is called Tarpeian Archives, where we re-upload archival video and audio. Like, for example, we have all of FDR's fireside chats, and it was just so enjoyable just actually listening to his fireside chats, to seeing what are the problems in the 1930s in the United States during the Great Depression, what are some of the solutions. Like, you get to really understand more about the Great Depression just by studying or just by listening to FDR himself talk than a lot of history textbooks, especially textbooks, but also history books and documentaries. Now, they are good, and you should, do the reading of the literature of what other historians have written. But I want to uh, put an emphasis on primary sources. Primary sources are, to me, the key to understanding American history more comprehensively than just relying on historians to tell you what the history is, because there's a lot of bias, not just
Absolutely.
not just bias from the individual historical figures that every single person in history is biased, but also from the historian perspective as well. What they include is a biased choice. What they
Yep.
don't include is a biased choice.
Yep.
How they're analyzing the stuff that they do include, that's a bias. So you have all these biases when you start to include more people, more historians. And then if the next generation of historians don't go back to the original primary sources, but just go back to the secondary sources, making their work tertiary sources, then they're adding a new generation of bias. And you have this generation of after generation of bias on top of bias on top of bias. And I just want to add Fontes go back to the source, the primary source, in order to have a better, less bias. It's still biased. Again, everything in history is biased, but
Yeah.
it's less biased. It's more clear to the actual history than simply relying on historians who are studying previous historians who are studying previous historians, which is another gripe that I have with academia today, where they're just writing what other historians have written about. But if you look at those historians that they're writing about, they are also doing the same thing just a
Yeah.
generation ago. So primary sources, primary sources, primary sources. If you want to be a good historian or just study history, I think you need to start with the primary sources. And if you don't understand, or if you want to understand how other people are understanding and analyzing the primary sources, then you can include secondary sources, tertiary sources, quaternary sources, other historians' work. So primary sources is the number one thing for me.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it is difficult to analyze primary sources, especially the further back you go. They don't talk
Yep.
like we do today.
Yep.
I know FDR's fireside chats were surprisingly accessible. So maybe start with that. Start with something easier. Work your way further back to when you go back to Thomas Jefferson. That boy used some words that we don't really understand. Yeah, so I get it. But also, dang, if you can discover something like the first person who like really was looking at, speaking of Thomas Jefferson, Sally Hemings, and what went down between him and her, and like, oh my gosh, scandalous. The first person to actually discover that didn't happen until recent decades. And what did they do? They went back and looked at primary sources, like, and so you could find something that no one else knows. You have this secret that no one else knows. That's exciting. Again, it's like a treasure hunt. So that's how I always frame it. Thanks, Kaiser, for the donation. I have a few other super chats, so we better get to these. So Mar says, any thoughts on the lack of proper media literacy education?
Ooh. Yeah, so I'm actually writing a extracurricular course apart from the 9 courses on the curriculum that covers media literacy, and it's kind of like what you just mentioned, where or what we both just talked about, which is going to primary sources, but being able to actually read and understand those primary sources is another big thing. So a lot of what literacy is just literature, just being able to read in the first place, and being able to read not just how we currently write, but also being able to read how people wrote 100 years ago or 200 years ago or 300 years ago. So it does take a little bit more when it comes to doing the reading of primary sources. You have to train yourself. I remember when I started reading George Washington's State of the Union addresses, and he uses the term vicissitudes a lot, and I'm like, oh, well, what does that mean? All right, and so I have to have a dictionary and a thesaurus next to me while I read these early documents. But eventually, you get used to the language. You get used to how people spoke, or I guess in this case wrote back then, and be a little bit quicker in actually reading all that material. If you give a, I don't know, a fifth grader George Washington's last State of the Union address, he might have a lot of trouble reading it. So you have to actually practice and do a lot of reading in order to build up that skill. But once you do, it's smooth sailing after that. But when it comes to media literacy, it goes beyond just primary sources. As I mentioned, you have secondary sources, tertiary sources. Being able to decide which secondary sources to include in your research is very. At first, for me, it was kind of difficult. You kind of just trust that historians and textbooks and documentaries are accurate and are providing history information in a way that is truthful. But you quickly learn that they're leaving a lot out, and you get to see more of a bias, especially political bias, with documentaries nowadays, especially the History Channel. Don't use the History Channel, please. Whatever you do, don't use them. So at first, you're naive, you trust a lot of sources, but the more you do this, the more you realize some sources are just not good. Some sources are just, you shouldn't just.
Well,
Yeah.
and let me chime in there. Like, I actually made a whole video about this. Like, how do you know a source is good? I used to teach my students the crap method, and I used to always frame it like, I like crap, and then let me explain. Crap stands for currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, purpose. So basically, currency, like, is it recent information? How far back does it go? The more recent stuff oftentimes like is closer to, or what's most closest to when an event happened is probably more accurate generally. Relevance, like how important is this information to what we're trying to get? Like, if we're trying to figure out something, is this information actually relevant to that? Authority is really important. Like, okay, where's this information coming from? Accuracy, I think, is more self-explanatory, like looking at stuff like bias. And then purpose, like, obviously I think I want to make a whole video about this in the future on my channel, because people need to know why I make videos. They need to know why I do this. Like, there's many reasons why, but primarily it's because I want to inform, educate whoever's watching. And I think that, like, we make assumptions that, oh, like, that's how everybody is. But no, there's a lot of people online that they couldn't care less about you being informed or educated. They have an agenda, or they're trying to sell something generally. So that's a big one. But so yeah, crap is a good method. Okay, I got other questions to go through. Sorry, we got to maybe be more brief here because we're almost at an hour already. V-Man says, I wish I had learned about things like the U.S. industrialization policy in Puerto Rico, Operation Bootstrap, which I don't know much about, which ironically is what pushed my family out of Puerto Rico in the mid-1940s. Yeah, if something directly affected your ancestors especially, I think that's a great gateway to get you more into history. Yeah, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, these kind of personal anecdotes are really good when it comes to encouraging people to study history. So my family on my mother's father's side came over in 1630 on the flagship Arabella, the Winthrop fleet. And
Wow.
so when I studied colonial history, I had a connection with that. And then I had an ancestor who died in the American Revolution. I am a member of the Sons of American Revolution. And
Nice.
so a revolutionary period is like my bread and butter. That's what I've studied the most of because I have that connection to that history. And I know, for every generation, there's people in America today who have a strong connection to a certain time period. If, say, you're an Italian family that came over here in the 1920s, a lot of people like to ask themselves, all right, what's going on in American history in the 1920s, and how did that impact my family? So having the family connection to history, which is ironically, or maybe not ironically, that's kind of like how history started in ancient times, is the worship of ancestors, of family, of knowing the um, achievements of your direct ancestors that give you a sense of identity, a sense of pride. So a lot of that is
Carrying on a
tied to
legacy.
the family. Yeah.
Yeah, carrying on a legacy is pretty freaking important. I think that helps motivate how history is taught for sure. Okay, Nathan, good to see you here, buddy. Thanks for that. The well wishes back at you. Also, thank you to Yee. It's Dustin. E Green has a couple here. Says my dad has a history degree, but he doesn't use it. Bull crap. He uses it, whether you realize it or not, because we addressed this earlier. The skills that you acquire getting a history degree. And then also, can we make suggestions for your videos? Absolutely. Just send me an email. I am mrbeat@gmail.com, or join the Discord server. That's a good place, actually. I'm more likely to check the Discord server. Let's see. Oh, it's Dustin again. I think they meant to send a super chat originally. Hi, future history teacher here. What are some good ways to make history more engaging for students, especially those who aren't interested in it? I love this question. You go first.
Well, I think you, Mr. Beat, is a really good example of how to make history more engaging and to encourage more people to study it.
Try.
To Don't be so bland when you're communicating history, and also kind of don't be forceful about it. You try to implement the lessons that you learn from history into your everyday life without being like, oh, I'm so smart because I studied or read this. um, People are pretty turned away from people who kind of act smug or pompous when it comes to being smarter than them. And you're not smarter. No one is smart when it comes to American history. We're all students, we're all learning. So the kind of pride that a lot of people have, especially in higher academia, there's a lot of that there.
Oh yeah.
Is kind of unnecessary and is part of the problem. We want this to be a more welcoming environment for everyone. And so if you have that kind of standard of like, oh well, if you don't know as much as I do, I'm going to look down on you, or I'm going to talk in a way that you don't really understand it to make you feel dumb, makes me feel smart. Don't do that. Don't try to communicate history in a way that is at the level of students who you're communicating with, and don't just keep it at that level. Do try to challenge them, but don't belittle them for not doing a lot of reading or of a lot of research on history. So it's like this weird mix of like, you don't want to show too much of what you know before you get your students up to that level for them to be able to understand it and want to learn more. So just, it is complicated. This part of social studies is how we communicate with each other and whatnot. So you will have a lot of trial and error, but try to make it engaging. Don't be too smart about it.
There's Luke there. Shout out to Luke, one of my earliest viewers, and good advice here, like making things more hands-on, encouraging discussion instead of just students passively listening. that was important to me. Like I had a lot of Socratic circles and debates and stuff like that. I think most importantly, go where the students are where the students are at. Meaning like, what are the students already doing? What are they listening to? What are they watching? Meet them where they're at whenever possible. That also goes with like just pedagogy, how they learn. And I realized early on when I started teaching that, every student was getting on YouTube. And so I was like, why would I go there too? And that's why I started making YouTube videos. The first videos I made were not for the general public. They were for only my students in class. So I think a lot of people don't know that. So yeah, meeting them where they're at is really important. Getting to know them, investing a lot in that relationship with the kid. You really have to just like people to be a successful teacher, I think. Great questions. Thanks for all these. James says, excited for the next election history video. Hope it comes out soon. Yeah, it comes out. I'm getting a lot of questions for this. It comes out on Valentine's Day, a week from Friday. Oh, my Joe Biden song comes out on Friday, by the way. If you are a channel member or Patreon supporter, you can watch it right now. So, okay. Let's see what else here. Okay, Javier says, have you heard Martin Goldberg? He wrote excellent books on socialism of the right and the truth of fascism and Mussolini and why. Okay, well, they're saying weird terms here. All right, I'll check it out, Javier. E. Green says, sometimes history repeats itself. Yeah, Mark Twain, I think, was right. I think it rhymes. It doesn't quite repeat itself exactly how it was, but okay. And then we got V-Man again here. Other things I wish I had learned was the U.S. suppression of pro-independence advocates in Puerto Rico, the gag law banning the flag radiation experiments on independence leader Pedro Abizu Campos. See, I know very little about this part of history. I think that V-Man wants to share all this stuff. More power to you. Yeah. Okay. Whoops. No. And I think that's the super chats. Okay. Hey, Jack. All right. So, it's been an hour. Let's go ahead and wrap it up. Thanks for everyone asking great questions and the few of you who asked kind of questionable questions. In conclusion, if you forgot, a great resource for you to check out is Tarpeia. I always Tarpeia. Pronunciations were never my thing. English was never my thing, even though that's what I do for a living as I communicate. But yeah, it's a great resource. Again, the link is in the description. I'm going to add your channels as well to the description. Anything else, Mark, that you would want the audience to know about before we conclude?
Yeah, so we are an educational nonprofit, 501c3. So all donations are tax deductible, and you can do that on our website. We are also looking for volunteers. So if you have some experience in education, specifically in American history, then you can apply and we can interview you and onboard you to our team of growing educators. Most of our volunteers right now are teachers. So right now they're busy off in the spring semester. They're mostly active volunteering in the summertime. So you have plenty of time to apply and be interviewed and onboard for working on what we do on the site, which is gathering primary source documents, writing summaries, and also curating a curriculum on American history. So yeah, we are an educational nonprofit. We have YouTube channels. Tarpeia is our main one. And then we have Tarpeian Archives, which is where most of our videos are. And then Tarpeian Summaries is where we are uploading the summary videos that we make. So hopefully I'll see all of you there, and we can grow the channel and the nonprofit to something that is more widespread for all students, teachers, and scholars.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate you coming on tonight. Preston, we missed you here. Shouted you out to my class recently. Thank you. Stream title reminded me of the reading The Social Studies Wars by Ronald W. Evans. Great book. I will check that out. Thanks for bringing it to our attention. Also, I wanted to point out, this was not, James says, just like movies are awesome to learn if you don't know, history is a suspense movie. Yes, well put, James. Speaking of which, what's it called? The Revenant? Have you seen that movie, The Revenant? Yes. The Revenant. It's a movie. It's probably mostly fictional, but I rewatched it last night. I was supposed to watch Groundhog Day. I forgot to watch. But anyway, The Revenant, starring Leonardo DiCaprio.
Oh yeah, I've
it's the
seen
one where the bear attacks him. Anyway, my uncle worked on that bear scene, by the way, and that's when I first watched it. I was like, this is so cool. But then I rewatched it a second time, and I'm like, holy crap! You're learning a lot of history here. You're learning about Native Americans and what it was like on the frontier for these fur trappers. And I'm just like, you know what? Even if that's all you do, you don't have to read books. Just watching movies, historical movies, even if they don't always get it accurate, it's still better than nothing, because again, the reason why we learn history are the lessons we pass down to future generations so that our species can survive. Final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, on the lessons thing, a lot of what history is trying to answer questions about society. If you look at the Revolutionary era, there's 4 questions during that time period in 2 different sets. The first question, or first set, is should the colonies have representation in Parliament, and what kind of jurisdiction does Parliament have over the colonies? And when those 2 questions couldn't be answered, that led to 2 new questions, a second set of questions. That is, should the colonies be free and independent states? And what will govern over these colonies, these now states? And those 2 questions were answered, one with violence, the Revolutionary War, and the other one with the Articles of Confederation and the individual state constitutions. And so studying history, you see the lessons that you get by looking at what is it that's moving society? What are we trying to answer? What questions are we trying to answer as a society? And how important are those questions to us? Obviously, they were very important for our founding generation. And you had minor questions as well. Slavery was a question all the way back then. You had some states abolish slavery immediately or heavily restricted, while some states protected it. And that became a major question leading up to the Civil War. So understanding what moves society in the form of these questions, I think, is a little bit helpful for us understanding them, but being able to get lessons out of that and being able to see, all right, what are the questions of our society today, and what are the possible answers, and what is the answer that we want as a society?
Very well put. I'm glad I had you on, because you're putting this in a way that I couldn't. You're better at talking than me about this stuff, for sure. So thanks for being here, Chainsaw Mac. I've read that. In fact, I made a video about generations, and I read that for the research for that video. Thanks for bringing that up. And everyone, thank you for watching. Have a good rest of your evening or morning or afternoon, whatever time of day it is. And support your local social studies organization, a historical society. They always need volunteers. They always need money. They always need resources. If your local school district is going to cut social studies, you need to go to that school board meeting and tell them that you don't want those social studies programs to be cut. And most importantly, if you care about social studies, you need to let everybody know about it. Even if you're annoying, like I can be annoying to my friends and family, just start sharing stories with them, and yeah, it just might work. Then they might start caring too about this stuff. All right. Thank you, Mark, and thank you all. Have a wonderful evening or afternoon or morning. Bye-bye.